October 25, 1944, 0438 amperes. M. Surigao Strait, Philippines. The sea was black glass under a sky streaked with dying stars. From the east came the low thunder of engines, American battleships crawling through the darkness like steel leviathans. On the horizon, the silhouettes of Japan's last proud warships loomed against the first hints of dawn. Between them stretched 20 miles of ocean about to turn into hellfire. Aboard the Yamashiro, Vice Admiral Nishimura stood on the bridge, his hands trembling not from fear but from fury. He had been taught that honor could defy fate, that a warrior's death was the highest victory. Yet across the water unseen radar screens pulsed in calm precision. While Japanese sailors prayed to ancestors, American gunners waited for coordinates. One side clung to ancient faith, the other trusted in cold, invisible mathematics. Then it began. A shell the size of a man's torso screamed through the sky, lighting up the sea with a flash brighter than dawn. Steel collided with belief. The Yamashiro shuddered fire, consuming her decks as the radio filled with screams. Above it all, radar operators on USS West Virginia spoke softly, almost politely, calling new targets by number. The age of human valor had just met the era of mechanical perfection. It was not merely a battle, it was civilization tearing its old skin apart. The question was no longer who was braver, but who understood the future. And before this night ended, the rising sun would vanish beneath the waves. If you want to witness how faith met fire, how legends drowned under the weight of machines, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and share this story, because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, and what we refuse to forget. The smoke from the first barrage still drifted across the sea, curling like black silk above the burning waters. Aboard what was left of the Yamashiro, young Lieutenant Haruto Senda clung to the railing, his face slick with oil and sweat. Below him, men shouted prayers that vanished beneath the roar of ruptured steel. The battleship groaned, a wounded beast unwilling to die. For a moment, the flames illuminated the rising flag still fluttering from the stern, defiant against the darkness. To Haruto, it looked like the Empire itself, beautiful, dying, and blind. Only hours before the fleet had sailed under that same flag with near religious conviction. Officers quoted the Emperor's words as if they were scripture. This battle will decide the destiny of the nation, Nishimura had told them. Every man aboard believed him. They were the heirs of 1,000 years of honor, trained to die before surrender, taught that courage could rewrite the laws of war. Yet now, as American radar-guided shells tore through the night, Haruto realized the truth was simpler and crueler. The Empire was fighting ghosts of its own making. The illusion had begun years earlier at Pearl Harbor. The day of the rising sun's triumph had filled Tokyo with delirium. Radios crackled with victory songs. People danced in the streets, believing Japan had humiliated a sleeping giant. Newspapers spoke of divine destiny. Students recited lessons about racial superiority and spiritual purity. The empire, they said, was chosen by the gods to rule Asia. Technology, resources, industrial scale, those were tools of the weak. The West builds machines, one naval instructor had told Haruto, but Japan builds men. He had believed it. They all did. Even as American submarines began choking Japan's supply lines, even as B-29 seconds appeared above the clouds like silver demons, faith held firm. They were taught that the soul of the warrior was stronger than the mechanics of modern war. To question that was treason not just against the emperor, but against the spirit of Japan itself. Haruto had watched the new recruits come aboard, boys barely 17, bowing before the ship's deck as though it were a shrine. Before each mission, they stood in rows, reciting oaths to die with smiles. It was not madness to them. It was ritual. Their instructors had told them the Americans feared death, that Westerners clung to comfort and would crumble under sacrifice. So they strapped on headbands painted with the red circle of the sun, believing that dying beautifully was greater than living pragmatically. But standing on the flaming deck of the Yamashiro, Haruto saw what those instructors never mentioned: the face of defeat. The American shells did not care about courage. The radar did not blink when it struck flesh. Honor did not redirect trajectory. The battle was not being fought between men. It was being decided by systems. He remembered how the admirals had dismissed American technology as crude and soulless. They had laughed at the idea of mass production, calling it vulgar. A single Yamato is worth 100 American ships, one officer had boasted. But when the first reports came of hundreds of carriers, destroyers, and supply vessels moving as one colossal organism across the Pacific, that arrogance began to taste like fear. Still, pride forbade retreat. The empire had promised its people glory, and pride demanded sacrifice to maintain the illusion. That illusion had been carefully cultivated. Propaganda posters showed the emperor as a living god, his light guiding soldiers through darkness. News reports never mentioned defeats, only strategic withdrawals. When entire fleets vanished, the headlines still spoke of glorious resistance. Haruto's own brother had died on Saipan, but the telegram said only, "He achieved an honorable end in service of the emperor." There was no word for failure in their language anymore, only honor and extinction. The empire had confused the two. Now, as the Yamashiro took another direct hit, Haruto realized how deep that delusion ran. He could hear men still cheering through the smoke, shouting banzai, as if sound alone could halt the bombardment. Some jumped into the flames, clutching their swords, convinced that their sacrifice would inspire the next generation. But there would be no next generation. The empire's youth had been consumed by the myth of purity, the idea that death was cleaner than change. He thought of Pearl Harbor again, not as victory, but as prophecy. The surprise attack that was supposed to cripple America had instead awakened something vast, relentless, and mathematical. Every ship Japan sank had been replaced 5 times over. Every bomb dropped on an American carrier was answered with 1,000 forged in Detroit, welded in Oakland, or loaded in San Diego. Japan had measured its strength in honor. America measured it in horsepower. And still the empire believed it could outlast a machine. Haruto's gaze drifted toward the burning horizon where tracer rounds painted the night red. Somewhere beyond that glow, American sailors were calmly reloading their faces, invisible behind steel and discipline. He wondered if they felt hatred. Probably not. To them this was just another operation, a coordinate on a map. The war had become impersonal, an equation. One side calculated, the other prayed. How had it come to this? How had a nation that once prided itself on discipline and learning abandoned reason for fanaticism? Perhaps it began when they replaced humility with mythology. When questioning leaders became blasphemy, when dying became easier than admitting mistake. The empire had built temples to sacrifice, but none to reflection. Another explosion split the deck. Haruto was thrown against the railing. The horizon was fire. Now the sea alive with wreckage. For a fleeting second he saw the reflection of the rising sun flag in the water, rippled, broken, sinking. It struck him. Then Japan had mistaken devotion for destiny. They believed willpower alone could bend reality, that courage could replace oil, that prayer could outthink radar. But courage without reason was just noise in the void. As the Yamashiro listed to starboard, Haruto pulled himself up one last time. He looked west toward the invisible enemy, and whispered, not in anger, but in revelation. So, this is what defeat feels like. The ship's final roll silenced the guns. Steam hissed from the ruptured boilers. The rising sun disappeared beneath a sea of steel and flame, and in that silence the illusion died with it. What remained was the question that would haunt Japan long after the war. How could a nation so rich in spirit be so blind to the power of knowledge? As dawn bled across the horizon, the answer waited beyond the smoke across an ocean inside. The humming factories where hammers struck rhythm like war drums and sparks flew like stars over the assembly lines. That was where the future had already begun. The empire's illusion had drowned, but the machine had just awakened. The morning light that rose over the Pacific did not belong to Japan anymore. It belonged to the smoke of 1,000 factories half a world away, to the rhythm of pistons and cranes that never slept. As the Yamashiro sank into her own reflection, the heartbeat of another empire pulsed across the ocean, steady, mechanical, unbreakable. America's strength was not in her admirals or heroes, it was in her engines. Across the continent, steel was being poured like liquid fire. At the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, the air thundered with the sound of rivet guns. Sparks rained like comets. as men and women welded the skeletons of bombers that would soon darken Japan's skies. Every hour, another B-24 rolled out of the hangar wings, gleaming propellers still warm from birth. One bomber every 63 minutes, no ceremony, no prayer, just precision. While the Japanese worshipped honor, the Americans worshipped process. In shipyards from Richmond to Mobile, thousands of women in overalls bent over plates of steel, their faces smeared with sweat and soot. They worked 12-hour shifts, hands blistered and backs aching, yet not a single one complained. Each weld, each bolt was a silent act of defiance. They were not soldiers, but their fingerprints lined the hulls of the ships that would end the war. Rosie the riveter's face stared out from posters on factory walls, a quiet challenge to the myth that courage belonged only to men or to the battlefield. At night, the cities glowed like furnaces. Convoys of trucks carried ammunition, fuel, radar parts, and machine tools along endless highways. The war effort was not a campaign. It was a choreography. The logistics network stretched from Kansas cornfields to Pacific coral islands, an unbroken artery of motion. In Washington, engineers worked side by side with mathematicians testing radar frequencies, calculating ballistic arcs, perfecting bomb sights that could strike from 7 miles high. The enemy still talked of spirits. The Americans measured signal-to-noise ratio. In the drafting rooms of the Navy Bureau of Ships, blueprints multiplied like scripture. Every line, every curve was calculated to fit into the rhythm of mass production. The Essex-class carriers born from those drawings were not ships, they were ecosystems. Each one carried 90 aircraft, 1,500 men, enough food to feed a city, and the firepower to erase another. Their decks were steel runways on floating fortresses, and behind every one was a factory that could build 5 more. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was evolution. Admiral Ernest King had once said, "We will build faster than they can sink us," and America did. Every destroyer lost in the Solomons was replaced before its wreck cooled. Every carrier hit by Japanese bombers reappeared in months, stronger, faster, bristling with radar. The Japanese fought with blood. The Americans fought with blueprints. The Japanese trained warriors. The Americans trained specialists, mechanics, signalmen, machinists, logistics officers. No one fought alone. Everyone was a cog in the colossal machine called democracy. To outsiders, that word democracy seemed too soft for war. But inside it was a kind of discipline the empire could never comprehend. In America, power did not flow from divine command. It was distributed across towns, factories, unions, laboratories. It meant decisions made by thousands of minds, working in harmony, not one emperor issuing decrees from a palace. That collective mind could adapt faster than any dictatorship could dictate. The Japanese believed obedience was strength. The Americans believed communication was. A foreman in Detroit could suggest a faster assembly method, and within weeks it would reshape production across the country. A pilot could report that his aircraft's fuel pump failed at high altitude, and within days the engineers would redesign it. Every failure became a lesson. Every mistake became a prototype. Even the spirit of sacrifice looked different here. In Japan, death was glorified. In America, survival was sacred. Soldiers were trained not to die for their country, but to make sure the enemy did. You can't win wars by dying in them. General Patton had said, his voice echoing across the airfields of England. That brutal pragmatism became the backbone of an entire civilization at war. And while Japan's young men were vanishing into kamikaze missions, American teenagers were learning to fly, using flight simulators to fix engines, to calculate vectors. They didn't see themselves as martyrs, they were operators. They trusted systems more than slogans. In places like Pearl Harbor, the scars of 1941 had become blueprints for reinvention. Where fire once consumed the fleet, new carriers now lined the docks like iron phoenixes. The USS Yorktown, Lexington, Essex, and Enterprise, names that carried not myth but momentum. Each ship launched with the same quiet efficiency as an automobile rolling off an assembly line. There were no speeches, no divine blessings, just a checklist, a whistle, and the rising hiss of steam. In the laboratories of Bell RCA and MIT, radar became the invisible sword. It could see through night, through fog, through deception itself. Engineers with slide rules had turned physics into prophecy. Waves bounced off the horizon, returning whispers that guided fleets across thousands of miles. To the Japanese, who still fought by instinct and intuition, this unseen power was sorcery. To the Americans, it was math. Back on the assembly floors, the rhythm never stopped. Women sang over the clatter of rivets, men drank coffee thick as tar, and shift whistles blew like battle horns. Newspapers hung on the walls with photographs of soldiers on distant islands. "Build it right," one worker said, tapping the metal plate with her hammer, "because my brother's under that sky." There was pride, but not arrogance, resolve, but not desperation. They were fighting for something larger than victory, for the belief that freedom could organize itself better than tyranny could command. Every rivet, every bolt, every bullet loaded into a crate was part of a single, unstoppable movement. America had turned democracy into an engine, and that engine now spanned oceans. By mid-1944, the Pacific itself seemed mechanical. Supply ships moved like gears, carriers turned like clock hands. Aircraft circled in perfect formation, feeding data through the new radar grids. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 38 Halsey's juggernaut covered an area larger than some nations. Its decks bristled with fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, its steel hulls reflecting the morning sun like mirrors of inevitability. Far below, in the machine rooms, sailors worked in blistering heat, their faces slick with oil. They were anonymous, unseen, yet every turn of a wrench mattered. Their war was not fought in glory, but in precision. They didn't see the enemy, they saw the readings on pressure gauges, the steady hum of turbines. Theirs was the faith of process, the conviction that perfection repeated enough times would conquer chaos. When news arrived that the Japanese fleet was gathering again in the Philippines, no one spoke of divine intervention or destiny. They spoke of fuel ratios, sortie rates, weather patterns, flight schedules. A democracy at war did not pray, it planned. And now, as the final bolts were tightened, the decks cleaned, and the ammunition stocked, the moment had come. Sirens wailed through the naval yards, echoing across cities and rivers. The workers paused, wiping grease from their faces, watching as their creations began to move. From San Francisco to Norfolk, from Seattle to Pearl Harbor, the ships of the United States Navy rumbled awake. Smoke billowed from their funnels, horns bellowed low and long across the water. Children stood on the docks, waving flags too big for their hands. Wives and mothers watched in silence, tears tracing lines through the soot on their cheeks. The fleet was not merely sailing, it was departing history. As hundreds of hulls cut through the waves, radar dishes turning like eyes and aircraft engines roared to life on carrier decks. The ocean began to tremble beneath their weight. The sea that once belonged to Japan was now ruled by the rhythm of turbines and the echo of industry. And in that moment, when the whistles screamed and the horizon filled with the silhouettes of ships, the true contrast became clear. One nation had chosen glory, the other had chosen endurance. The empire prayed to the past. The Republic engineered the future, and as the sun sank over the Pacific, the largest armada in human history pointed its steel bow toward Leyte Gulf, where faith and machinery would soon collide. The ocean had turned to iron. Its surface shimmered with oil and blood beneath the first grey light of dawn. From the east came the slow rumble of turbines, the sound of an empire awakening for the kill. Task Force 77 advanced in silence, the decks of American battleships slick with dew radar dishes spinning like clockwork halos above them. Men moved with rehearsed calm voices, low eyes fixed on glowing screens. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay the shattered remnants of the Japanese Southern Force, moving unknowingly into the jaws of annihilation. Aboard the USS West Virginia, Captain Jesse Oldendorf stood at the bridge, coffee gone cold in his hand. He had fought at Pearl Harbor, had watched ships burn and brothers die. Now, the same ocean that once devoured his fleet would become the stage for retribution, not of vengeance but of precision. "Open fire when ready," he said quietly. Those 4 words crossed the radio like prophecy. In an instant, the horizon exploded. The West Virginia's 9 16-inch guns roared as one, hurling shells the weight of automobiles into the night. Each blast shook the sea, lighting the clouds orange and white. The radar operators adjusted bearings, feeding corrections to the gunners. Range 2,000 yards, bearing steady. Another salvo. The ocean heaved as the next American ship, the Maryland, joined in, then the Mississippi, then the Tennessee. Within minutes the sky was alive with thunder, the kind that rolled through the bones. To the west, in the chaos of the Yamashiro, Vice Admiral Nishimura gripped the railing as fire poured from his ship's hull. His voice was drowned by the screams of metal and men. "Increase speed, prepare to ram," he shouted, though he knew it was futile. His flagship, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was now a burning cathedral. Flames licked the pagoda mast, smoke swallowed the moon. Shells rained down, guided by radar invisible to his eyes, as if the enemy fought with the gods of the storm themselves. For centuries, Japan's warriors had believed that courage could defy odds, that a noble death could bend fate. But fate no longer bent, it calculated. On the American ships, calm voices read coordinates tracked bearing wind speed elevation. It was not rage that guided their guns. It was rhythm. The battle had become mathematics wrapped in thunder. The radar screens glowed like oracles in the dark lines, sweeping in slow circles, marking each echo with clinical precision. The Japanese fleet, once masters of the Pacific, now appeared as faint blips, each one a death sentence in waiting. "Target 2, closing at 18 knots, a young operator murmured. "Bearing locked." The commander nodded, and another volley tore through the sea. The Yamashiro shuddered. Its decks erupted as secondary explosions ripped through ammunition stores. Men who had sworn to die with honor now fought to stay alive, stumbling through corridors of flame. The ship's pagoda tower tilted slightly to port, glowing like a shrine collapsing in slow motion. Haruto Senda, the young lieutenant who had survived the earlier bombardment, crawled toward a jammed hatch, coughing blood. Around him the sound was no longer battle, it was demolition. Above, dive bombers from USS Franklin streaked through the clouds, their wings gleaming in the sunrise. They came down in waves, engines howling, releasing torpedoes that skimmed the waves like silver serpents. The first struck Mogami, another Japanese cruiser, ripping it open midsection. The blast flung men into the air like shadows. "Torpedo hit amidships," shouted one pilot before banking away the reflection of the explosion, filling his canopy. From the American flagship, the voice of Admiral Kinkaid crackled through the comms. "We have them in the crossfire. Maintain formation." His tone was steady, emotionless, as though he were conducting an orchestra. And indeed, he was an orchestra of steel, fire, and calculation. The gunfire from 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers formed a symphony that consumed the night. In the chaos, the Yamashiro tried one last desperate maneuver, turning south to avoid the barrage, but the radar tracked her every move, plotting the curve of her agony in perfect arcs. Another salvo struck her stern, tearing the hull wide open. Fire reached the fuel stores, igniting an inferno that roared through the corridors like a living thing. The ship began to list heavily, its bow dipping into the waves. Haruto reached the main deck, just in time to see the forward guns. Once symbols of power, now bent and broken, pointing uselessly toward heaven. To the Americans, she was a target. To the Japanese, she was a temple dying in slow collapse. The Yamashiro burned from within her decks, glowing red, the imperial flag still flying even as the mast melted. "She looks like a shrine falling into the sea," one U.S. officer whispered through binoculars. "A shrine built on pride." For hours the barrage continued, relentless and mechanical. The Japanese destroyers Asagumo and Yamagumo tried to shield the flagship, charging forward with suicidal intent, their torpedoes streaking through the surf. But radar-guided counterfire shredded them mid-run, tearing their hulls apart before they could reach range. On the American ships, sailors barely looked up. They were too busy reloading, recalculating, repeating the machine feeding itself. When the last guns fell silent, the horizon glowed like the embers of a dying Sunday oil burned across the surface, spreading rainbow fire. The Yamashiro rolled onto her side, the screams of trapped sailors echoing through the smoke, at 455 amperes. The great ship finally disappeared beneath the waves, dragging 1400 souls into the abyss. Only a handful survived, pulled from the water hours later, burned half-blind, still whispering banzai into the void. On the bridge of the West Virginia, Captain Oldendorf lowered his binoculars. His voice was quiet. "Cease fire." The guns went silent. The sea hissed and steamed. Around him sailors exhaled some whispering prayers, others staring at the glow on the horizon where their enemy had vanished. No cheers, no celebration, only exhaustion and an eerie understanding that something irreversible had happened. That night the Pacific had witnessed more than victory. It had witnessed transformation. The old ways, the code of the sword, the worship of death, the myth of invincibility, had met the age of systems where reason and machinery ruled. Honor had drowned in its own fire. As the sun rose, the American fleet regrouped, their decks blackened with soot, their barrels still hot. Planes circled overhead, scanning for survivors. The radio hummed with reports, enemy force destroyed. Minimal losses. It was efficient, almost sterile. Beneath the calm, though, ran a quiet unease. The men who had unleashed that storm knew they had crossed into something new, war stripped of romance, of nobility, of face. From here on, it would be fought not by warriors, but by mechanisms, by data, by precision. It was the beginning of a cold mechanical dominance that would outlive them all. And in that still morning light, as smoke drifted across the strait, one could almost hear the ocean whisper its verdict. Courage without calculation is suicide. Faith without understanding is extinction. The sea went quiet. The machines powered down. Waves carried the ashes of two civilizations, one dying, one ascendant. And in the silence after the thunder, only the hum of engines remained steady and eternal, pushing west toward the next horizon. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, an echo that would soon reshape the world itself. The morning after the battle, the sea was still burning. Oil fires drifted across the waves like funeral torches, marking the graves of ships that had once been legends. The strait reeked of metal salt and silence. Thousands of men had vanished into the black water, officers, gunners, signalmen, each a drop in the ocean of a dying empire. From the decks of the American ships, sailors looked out over the wreckage in stunned quiet. The enemy had been annihilated, but the victory felt less like triumph and more like revelation. The numbers told a story too large for words. Out of the 34 Japanese vessels that entered the battle, nearly all were gone. The Yamashiro lay twisted on the seabed, her pagoda mast bent like a broken spine. The cruiser Mogami had exploded in a storm of secondary detonations. The destroyers Asagumo and Yamagumo were torn apart, vanishing beneath geysers of flame. Over 4,000 sailors were dead in a single night. The American fleet, by contrast, lost only a handful of men and no capital ships. Radar coordination and overwhelming firepower had turned the strait into an execution ground. The Imperial Navy's southern arm was gone, and with it the last illusion of parity. Across the Pacific, the Empire's vast web of bases began to crumble. The once proud navy that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Indian Ocean, now limped from port to port with no fuel, no spare parts, and no replacements. Japan's arsenals were silent, its skies empty. The factories that had built the Zero fighter and the long-range torpedo were now piles of rubble under American bombs. In Tokyo, the truth could no longer be disguised by propaganda. Reports arrived in fragments, ships overdue convoys, destroyed pilots missing. Admirals who had once spoken of divine destiny now spoke in whispers about shortages and despair. The Empire's war machine, once disciplined and efficient, had become a ghost of paperwork and broken commands. Fuel reserves had fallen below crisis levels. Each sortie drained the last breath of the Empire's lungs. One naval officer in a diary later found after the war wrote with brutal honesty, "We are no longer an empire. We are a funeral procession of steel." By early 1945, the Imperial Navy could barely leave port. The last remnants of its strength, the super battleship Yamato, the pride of Japanese industry, was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, loaded with just enough fuel for a single journey. The ship's crew knew they would never return. It was not strategy. It was theatre, the final act of an empire that had mistaken death for victory. When American aircraft found and sank her within hours, it was more than the loss of a ship. It was the end of a philosophy. The collapse of Japan's war effort was not sudden. It was systematic. The same precision that had guided American shells through the night at Surigao Strait now dismantled the empire piece by piece. U.S. Submarines severed shipping lanes, starving Japan of oil from the Dutch East Indies. B-29 bombers erased industrial cities in hours, and still Tokyo broadcast messages of defiance promising that 100 million hearts will burn together. But the fire had already gone out. On the home islands, ordinary people bore the truth long before the generals admitted it. Black markets replaced rations. Families boiled bark and weeds to survive. Mothers sent sons to the army knowing there would be no letters, no bodies returned, only silence. Cities that had once glowed with paper lanterns now burned under magnesium light. The myth of invincibility, once the empire's greatest weapon, had become its most poisonous lie. Philosophically, the war had turned into a mirror. One side worshipped willpower, the other worshipped organization. Japan had built its empire on obedience and sacrifice, believing the purity of spirit could transcend the limits of material reality. America built its campaign on data logistics and adaptation, believing that human imperfection could be overcome by collective design. In that sense, the war was never simply East versus West, it was the old world versus the modern one. The empire's admirals could not comprehend the scale of their opponent. They measured war in courage. The Americans measured it in throughput. They saw honor in individual death. The Americans saw progress in collective survival. Even as their ships sank, Japanese officers issued orders to fight with soul, never realizing that their enemy fought with systems. Admiral Motome Ugaki, in his final diary entry before leading a kamikaze flight in 1945, wrote, "We do not lose because we lack spirit. We lose because we lack oil, time, and humility." Those words, scrawled hours before his death, were the epitaph of an empire. In hindsight, it was never truly a contest of bravery. It was a contest of civilization itself, between one that bowed to myth and one that bent steel to its will. The American soldiers did not claim to be gods. They were engineers, logisticians, communicators. They built victory out of process, out of collaboration. The empire that had glorified death was defeated by a society that glorified function. And yet, for all its discipline, even the American victors felt the weight of what they had destroyed. When news of Japan's fleet annihilation reached Pearl Harbor, there were no cheers, only a quiet nod among the officers. They had killed an enemy, yes, but they had also ended an era. The age of individual valor, of heroic last stands and sacred wars had drowned in the smoke of the Surigao Strait. Back in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's advisors debated how long the people could endure. Some still argued for surrender with honor, others for total annihilation. The emperor, once believed divine, now stared from his bunker windows at a sky filled with American bombers. The empire that had promised 1,000 years of rule could not even guarantee 1,000 more days. In July 1945, when the U.S. firebombing of Tokyo killed over 100,000 in a single night, the myth was finally broken. The people stopped singing patriotic songs. They stopped believing that sacrifice would bring victory. They understood what their leaders never could, that courage without wisdom was suicide, and faith without reflection was slavery. The empire's flag still flew above the imperial palace, but it had become a symbol of exhaustion rather than pride. The officers still wore their swords, but their scabbards were empty of meaning. The people no longer looked to the emperor for salvation. They looked to the sky and saw the shadow of their own ending. And yet, amid the ashes, a strange clarity emerged. Japan had not been defeated by superior soldiers, but by a superior understanding of how to unite human beings toward purpose. The war had proven that machinery and democracy, when fused together, could wield a power far beyond the reach of tyranny. As the tide receded and the waters of Surigao Strait calmed, pieces of wreckage floated to the surface. Helmets, papers, fragments of steel. On one twisted plate from the Yamashiro's hull, an American diver later found an inscription etched by heat, the imperial chrysanthemum half-melted, half-preserved, a symbol of beauty burned into ruin. The empire's death was not instantaneous. It was slow, methodical, and inevitable. Each defeat revealed another truth, each wreck another lesson. The myth had sunk, but from its ashes would one day rise a nation that finally understood the price of blind devotion. The waves rolled on, indifferent to memory. The sun set red over the Philippines, reflecting off the oil-stained sea. The battle was over, but the story was not. Because even as the last embers of the empire faded into darkness, history began to whisper not of revenge nor glory, but of warning. And from the drifting wreckage came the voice of time itself carried by the wind. No nation dies in a single battle. It dies when it refuses to learn. The ocean went quiet again. Only the faint creak of broken steel remained rocking gently on the tide as if the sea itself were mourning. But the silence would not last. Beyond the horizon the engines of a new world were already warming, and through the still air came a faint, solemn truth: the empire had fallen. But humanity was just beginning to understand why. The sun rose slowly over the Philippines, pale and hesitant, as if the sky itself was unsure it wanted to witness what remained. The sea that had boiled with fire and fury only hours before was now eerily still. Oil slicks shimmered across the surface, painting the water in shades of black and gold. Pieces of steel floated quietly, twisting and turning with the current, fragments of ships, fragments of men, fragments of belief. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and something heavier, the silence of history taking its first breath after the storm. The Americans watched from their decks as the horizon burned with morning light. Some leaned on the railings, staring into the oil-stained waves where the empire had vanished. Others sipped their coffee in quiet disbelief. They had survived, but they knew this was no ordinary victory. It was too complete, too final. The Japanese fleet hadn't simply been destroyed. It had been erased, reduced to echoes beneath the sea. The world had just witnessed the death of an idea that honor could stand against machinery, that courage could outlast organization, that faith could defy reason. And yet within that destruction lay something profoundly human. War had shown what nations were truly made of, not just weapons but systems, not just bravery but the ability to adapt, to learn, to unite. The United States had built not merely an army but a living organism that could think, rebuild, and move as one. Factories, farms, universities, laboratories, soldiers and civilians all pulsed together like arteries in a single body. It was not just democracy that won. It was the idea that freedom could be disciplined without tyranny, that chaos could be transformed into coordination. On the opposite side of the ocean, Japan's survivors returned home to a country unrecognizable. Cities were ruins, skies grey with ash. The emperor's voice, once the sound of divinity, now cracked through the radio like a confession. For the first time in history, he spoke to his people not as a god but as a man. His message was simple: endure the unendurable. In those 4 words, the illusion shattered completely. The empire had fallen, but from its ruins, something far more resilient began to take shape. A nation forced to confront itself, to learn humility from defeat, and to rebuild from the bones of its own destruction. In the years that followed, Japan would rise again not through conquest, but through mastery of creation. The same discipline once forged for war would now serve peace, turning swords into circuits and battleships into blueprints for industry. That transformation, the shift from blind pride to enlightened purpose, was the true echo of the storm. Meanwhile, America, now the unquestioned power of the modern world, faced its own reflection. In the smouldering aftermath of victory, it realized what it had unleashed. The machine it had built, the great industrial technological engine of war, could not simply be turned off. It had to be guided, restrained, given meaning. The lessons of Surigao Strait were clear. When human ingenuity becomes absolute, the only limit left is conscience. Every war leaves behind 2 kinds of debris, the wreckage of weapons and the wreckage of belief. The Pacific was full of both. The Japanese ships, rusting beneath the sea, were tombs of pride. The American machines, still steaming toward home, were monuments to progress. But progress untempered by reflection could become as dangerous as any empire's ambition. The victors knew it. They could feel it in the vibration of their engines, in the heat still rising from the barrels of their guns. They had won the war. Now they had to prove they deserved the peace. The waves rolled on, carrying the memory of what had happened here. Fishermen, decades later, would still find twisted metal caught in their nets, relics of that night, when technology and tradition collided in one apocalyptic symphony. But time, like the tide, has a way of softening even the hardest steel. Coral grew over wreckage, turning weapons into reefs. Life returned. The ocean forgot the names of the dead, but not the lesson they left behind. History would remember the Battle of Leyte Gulf as the moment Japan's empire broke. But deeper than that, it was the moment the 20th century declared what kind of civilization it would be. From that day forward, wars would not be decided by swords or speeches, but by systems, by the precision of minds working together, by the flow of information, by the ability to organize chaos into coherence. The age of the lone hero was over. The age of collective intelligence had begun. Still, somewhere beneath those calm waters, the ghosts of the past whisper. They remind us that no machine, no radar, no weapon can ever replace the heart behind it. The Americans did not win because they built better ships, they won because they built them together. The Japanese did not fall because they lacked courage. They fell because they refused to question the myths that bound them. In every age, the same truth returns: strength without wisdom is destruction. Wisdom without compassion is hollow. The sun climbed higher, gilding the ocean in gold. On the decks of the surviving ships, sailors began to clean the barrels of their guns, mop the soot, and repair the steel. Life, relentless as ever, continued. But deep down, they all understood that something far greater than victory had taken place. Humanity had crossed a line. The storm was over, but its echo would never fade. Because every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually meets its reflection in the mirror of its own making, and on that reflection depends its survival. When steel sinks to the bottom of the sea, only the idea remains. And that idea, the one that learns, adapts, and rebuilds, belongs not to the strongest, but to the wisest. When steel sinks to the ocean floor, only thought survives, and it belongs to those who learn. The sea is calm now. The fires are gone, the guns are silent, and the horizon stretches clean and endless as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath that calm surface lie the bones of an empire, and the echoes of 1,000 men who believed they could command destiny. The ocean remembers even when nations forget. History is not written by those who fight the loudest, but by those who understand what the fighting meant. The Battle of Leyte was never just a clash of ships, it was a collision between two worlds, one chained to myth and one driven by method. The storm that swept across those waters did more than destroy a fleet. It redrew the map of power, technology, and belief. For America, victory was more than conquest. It was revelation. It proved that courage could be organized, that freedom could be structured, that unity could be engineered without tyranny. For Japan, defeat was not the end, but the beginning of transformation. From the ashes of surrender would rise a nation that learned to rebuild, to innovate, and to find dignity, not in death, but in creation. The wreckage rusts beneath the waves, but the lesson endures. Progress is not born from pride nor from prayer. It comes from reflection, from humility, from the courage to learn what war tries to teach too late. The wind carries the faint echo of that truth across the Pacific. Still that steel may sink, flags may fall, but the human mind, capable of reason, compassion, and reinvention, always resurfaces. The empire fell, the storm passed, but the echo remains, and in that echo lies the warning and the hope of every generation that dares to build its own world from the ruins of the last.